You're listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast with Matt Tomasi and can be found at borntokickarse.com/episode 14.
Welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast, where you're introduced to the most fascinating people on the planet. Learn the ingredients of greatness that you can apply to your life. And now your host, Matthew Tomasi.
Today's podcast is brought to you by audible.com. Get a free audiobook of your choice and a 30-day free trial by visiting borntokickarse.com/audible. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. To download your free audiobook today, go to borntokickarse.com/audible. Again, that's borntokickarse.com/audible for your free audiobook. Do you know someone or know of someone who walks the walk and would like to hear them on the Born to Kick Arse podcast? They can be from any field, but they need to have an inspiring story that will help to motivate others to achieve their own goals. If you do, please head over to borntokickarse.com/suggest a guest and fill out the form. We'd love to hear from you. Leon McCarron is a Northern Irish adventurer, filmmaker, writer, and motivational speaker. Leon specialises in long-distance, human-powered expeditions. Some of his past adventures include walking 3,000 miles across China and filming a TV show for National Geographic. He's carried the Olympic flame along a section of the Northern Irish coast as part of the London 2012 relay. He's ridden 14,000 miles from New York to Hong Kong. He's trekked 1,000 miles through the Empty Quarter Desert in Oman and created a feature-length film called Into the Empty Quarter. He's followed the longest river in Iran from source to sea and created a film called Karun. And he's also travelled across Argentina on horseback. In this interview, Leon talks about his recently completed 1,000-mile walk through the heart of the Middle East. Enjoy the interview. Leon McCarron, welcome to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
So you've recently come back from a 1,000-mile trek through the heart of the Middle East. Before we get into that, you've done quite a few adventures, I'm guessing since university. Some of the things that you've done, you've cycled 14,000 miles from New York to Hong Kong. You've walked 3,000 miles across China from, I think, was it northern China through to Hong Kong?
Yep.
Yeah, you've carried the Olympic flame. You've also trekked 1,000 miles through the Empty Quarter Desert in Oman. You're a filmmaker. You've created a number of documentaries. You've also travelled the longest river in Iran, and you've also travelled across Argentina on horseback. How did you get into this lifestyle? Were you always like an adventurous kid growing up? Can you maybe give us a background, what you're into growing up and how you got into this adventurous lifestyle?
Yeah, sure. I got into this as a lifestyle, or rather I got into this as a job and career and kind of full-time vocation through having it just as a hobby and a passion. But I'm not really sure where that came from initially. There was no one moment where I could really hone in on that this is where it all started. As a kid, I grew up in the north part of Northern Ireland, so I was right up in the north coast, and I had a really outdoorsy childhood. I was one of those kids that was kind of kicked out the door in the morning and told to go and play in the woodlands until it was time to come home for dinner, which was the best possible childhood I could have imagined. I loved it. So I was always pretty comfortable and pretty happy in the outdoors and valued spending time in the wilderness, or at least relative wilderness, value that quite highly. But I mean, I never for one second considered that I would do anything like this more long term. I went to university and I did film studies at university. I'm not quite sure why, but it was quite an interesting degree, but not necessarily the most useful one for finding a job. And while I was at university, I didn't do a whole lot. I certainly didn't go on any expeditions. I got into fitness a little bit more than I'd ever been before. I started running and cycling a bit more, but it wasn't until I finished university and realized that I was at that terrible age in life where I needed to find out what I was going to do with the hours of every day, and how I was going to try and make some money and find something fulfilling to do with myself. And I couldn't think of what that was. I not a clue what that was. So I ended up deciding that I would kind of buy myself some time. So I spent a year working various jobs to earn enough money so that I could go off and have an adventure, really to kind of fill time and hopefully create a little bit of mind space so that I could figure out what it was that I might want to do. And I don't know what it's like where you are, but certainly for where I was growing up and in Northern Ireland and then university in England, there was this real pressure, not just to decide on what job to get for that moment in time, but what career to have for the rest of your life, you know. And the idea of deciding when I was 21 years old, or even deciding when I was 18 years old what I should be doing for the next 50 years is just terrifying and ridiculous. So I'd set off on an adventure to try and create a little bit of space in my mind and see what happened. And that was the first journey, which was the bicycle trip. I set off from New York with no real plan of where I was going to go, but hoping that it would lead me to somewhere interesting, and everything else followed on from there, really by accident.
And sorry, how old were you at this point? Early 20s?
I think I was 22 or maybe just 23 when I set off on the bike trip, something around there.
And then you headed west, did you, from New York across America to the West Coast? Was that right?
Yeah, across the West Coast. And, you know, that adventure just took on a whole life of its own. I was completely clueless, and I knew nothing. I was totally underprepared. I was scared of everything. You know, I'd never done anything like this on my own before. And even though the US is pretty familiar culturally to someone like me from Western Europe, it still feels, you know, it's a long, long way from home. And to suddenly be out there on a bicycle in the middle of nowhere in the central part of North America, it can be pretty scary. But it's the single most formative experience of my life by a long shot. You know, it's been chucked in at the deep end on a serious scale, and it was really sink or swim at that point. And I was, you know, of all the things I've done, I see myself as pretty lucky to have been fortunate enough to be in those positions. And the thing that I'm probably really proud of is that the 22-year-old version of myself was brave enough to set off on a bicycle and see what happened.
And whereabouts did you sleep? Did you have like a tent in your backpack? Was that one of the things that you'd packed and taken with you for this bike ride across America? Yeah, I had. I mean, I was fresh out of university, and then I'd worked for a year to fund this trip. But I had the equivalent of, I don't know, $5,000 something like that, for the whole journey. So I was on a total budget. I was spending $2 to $5 a day max on food, and I had my accommodation budget was zero, which meant I either had to sleep in my tent or find somewhere else to sleep that didn't cost any money. So my kind of baseline sleeping plan was just to find somewhere to pull in off the road and put my tent up, or if it was warm, just lie down in my sleeping bag. But I mean, America gets a bad rap sometimes in the
the travel world as being, this kind of faceless, corporate, unfriendly place, but it's not. I mean, it's an incredibly friendly, generous country, and I experienced the height of kindness and generosity from people who, saw this strange, sweaty, bearded bloke turning up on a overloaded bicycle. And instead of running the other direction, some people ran the other direction, but instead of everyone doing that, some people invited me in and let me stay in their homes, or let me camp in their garden, or give me food, or bought me beer, or all the things you want when you're on an adventure. And that was the first time I'd made myself vulnerable enough to kind of be open to those experiences. And I think it completely altered the way I looked at the world. I went from being relatively afraid of the rest of the world because I didn't know anything about it, to ending up with this kind of deep set sense that the world is generally a good place, and we can rely on that. There's always going to be anomalies, but 99.9% of the people in the world everywhere are good and kind, and I think that's a nice approach to be able to have.
Now, just in the interest of time, I want to, and it doesn't really do it justice, but you've got so many adventures that you've been through since the ride across America, and we can maybe come back to some of them if we've got time. But you've recently just come back from your latest expedition or adventure. Can you tell us more about that, and how did this come about? How did tell us about when the seed was planted for this 1,000-mile walk through the heart of the Middle East?
Yeah, sure. So the big difference between the bicycle trip I did, which ended up taking about 14 months and was 14,000 miles long and finished in Hong Kong, having started in New York. The big difference between that trip and just about everything else I've done since is that first trip was just a lifestyle choice. I just went off to do it for me, and I had no plans. I certainly, didn't expect to make a career out of it. But after that, and I came back and realized that perhaps I had some stories to tell that other people might be interested in, and I'd been to places that people don't normally get to, I started trying to turn this passion I had into a job, and it slowly developed from there over the intervening years. So now what I do is I once or twice a year, I try and go off on a long journey, but with the intent purpose of creating a story out of it that I can share with people to spread some sort of message. And in the most recent case, I've spent quite a lot of time in the Middle East recently, and I love it. It's one of my favorite parts of the world, and it's so vast and varied and diverse. And I love the people and places of the Middle East, but I feel like certainly in where I came from and where I spent a lot of my time in Western Europe, there's a lot of that fear of the Middle East and what it represents in Europe. So what I wanted to do was go and have an adventure, a proper good old fashioned adventure, but to do it in the Middle East and through that show what a kind and friendly and exciting place it is. And I heard that there were some new hiking trails being developed in this part of the Middle East, very, very new. No one had really done much hiking on them before. So I decided I would try and test them out and make up a little bit in between. But I would try and hike from Jerusalem to Mount Sinai, following new trails and landscapes in the West Bank of Palestine, the length of Jordan, and across the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt.
Oh, yeah, that would have been incredible. And how long did it take to plan this journey?
It took. Well, I'd been thinking about a trip in the West Bank section for a good couple of years, but because it's a relatively tense area there, politically, geopolitically, and I was keeping an eye on what was going on, and it didn't seem like it was a very sensible idea to be going there and having an adventure, or not an appropriate place to be going and having an adventure for a couple of years. So that one had been in the back of my mind, but the longer journey only really formulated probably 6 to 9 months before I set off. And once it looked like everything was calm in the region and I could go and do what I wanted to do, it started to take shape. And that's when a friend of mine, Dave Cornthwaite, came on board as well, probably about 6 months before we set off.
And both of you turned up, arrived at the same time, and then, is that right?
Yeah, so we both flew in and arrived into Jerusalem and spent a few days just sorting out kit there and doing a bit of planning for the first few days, and then we set off north through the West Bank.
And what's it like, that part of the world? When you first fly in, you know what you see on the media. Every sort of second night, there's reports of more sort of bombings and terrorist activities and stuff like that. But what's it like in Jerusalem and Bethlehem and Jericho and these sorts of places? Is it packed? Is there heaps of security? What's it like?
Yeah, Jerusalem, when we got there, was pretty tense, and that's because it's right at the crux of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and it's one of the few cities that's really a shared space between Israelis and Palestinians. So there's a lot of armed Israeli security. There's a lot of Israeli civilians carrying weapons openly, and it's such a beautiful and spiritual and fantastic city. But man, it's quite a hard place to spend time, because it's just got this. Certainly, when we went there the first time, it had this real air of fear. Everyone was scared of everyone else. But once we left Jerusalem, we were into the West Bank, into the rest of Palestine, and places like Bethlehem and Jericho are much more relaxed because they're Palestinian cities getting on with what they're getting on with, and it just feels more like those exciting, bustling Middle Eastern cities that I've come to know from other parts of the region. So that was our experience the rest of the way through the Palestinian West Bank, was that it was either very empty and quiet in the hills, these lovely green rolling hills, or it was kind of lively and exciting in the villages and towns, and always very friendly. So there was no real tension except for in Jerusalem or on the odd occasion when we arrived at checkpoints and met with Israeli security forces again. And
did you visit many of the main sacred sites?
Yeah, we did. I mean, you can't help but visit them. That's the amazing thing about that area. Our journey wasn't a spiritual one. I guess arguably it was still a pilgrimage in one way, in that I think a pilgrimage is just simply a journey that's searching for something, and we were definitely looking to find something on that trip. But it wasn't a spiritual journey per se. But you leave Jerusalem and you walk up over the Mount of Olives and down past Rachel's tomb, and you cross over and you're headed for Jericho, and you pass through Wadi Kelt and the Palace of Herod and the Monastery of Temptation, and just all of these things that I grew up with in a kind of Western Christian tradition. And you're right there, and it's you get to the Monastery of Temptation where Jesus is meant to have been tempted by the devil for 40 days and 40 nights, and there's a Palestinian guy selling watermelon and hanging out underneath, and you just sit there and have some watermelon and have a chat. And it's not, I don't think it's how it's nothing like the Sunday school version of what it is represented to be, but it's much better. It's real life, and it's great just to have so much history around. So I love that kind of byproduct of traveling in this region.
And when you were you sleeping again in tents, or were you, sleeping in people's houses, or like a bit of both?
Yeah. So over the course of the journey that I did, the 1,000 miles, it was a really varied, but mostly in Palestine, we stayed in people's houses, simply because that we really wanted to get an insight into the culture, and that was a good way to do it. And hiking and as recreation and camping and outdoor activities is still pretty new to that part of the world, and we just wanted to be extra careful given the kind of political context of the place. So we decided against camping too much in the West Bank, just to make sure that we didn't scare anyone else. It'd be pretty odd to just for some poor shepherd to find this weird looking tent in the middle of their field. So that was our rationale for that.
And did you go on this particular journey? Was your intent to also film this as well?
Yeah, so we both Dave and I carried pretty small video cameras, but high definition, high quality cameras, so we could film it. And there will hopefully be a couple of films coming out before the end of the year from the journey.
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, I've seen a couple of the previews for your other films, and they look really good. I haven't actually seen them yet, but the McCarron one, that looks really good. Is that your favourite one that you've produced?
It's hard to say. They're all quite different. That one was probably the most exciting journey I've been on. The most real, sort of raw, visceral adventure. So yeah, it's hard to beat that.
With I noticed as well there was a funny sort of clip on your website, leonmccarron.com. Particularly for this adventure, the Walk the Massa one. Dave played a bit of a trick on you with some chocolates and like a 1 kilo bag of chocolates.
Yeah, I wasn't that impressed with that.
Yeah, can you maybe shed some light on that?
Yeah, sure. Dave and I had been joking around because the thing with walking journeys is that it seems like it's quite easy because, most of us walk around all the time. But once you start loading everything you need into a rucksack and then carrying it up over pretty tough terrain, it becomes quite difficult. So you really start counting the grams of weight in your backpack. And Dave and I were joking around that we'd load rocks into each other's backpacks without the other person knowing. And then I told Dave a story about how once on another trip with someone else, I'd hidden a little present for them in their bag for Christmas, and they discovered it, and it was this tiny little light present, but I thought it was funny because I'd made them carry it. And so Dave took that idea and ran with it, and decided that he would get me a present, but not a small light one. He got me a kilogram bag of chocolate nuts, which he then hid inside my sleeping bag, which was right at the bottom of my rucksack, and which he knew I was unlikely to open for a few days because we weren't camping that often. And in the end, it was something like 6 days that I carried this thing around without realizing. And then eventually he just felt so guilty he had to tell me. But luckily it was the sort of thing that I could just eat my way through pretty quickly.
And with the locals that you met throughout the journey, what are they? Do many of them speak English at all?
It varies from place to place. There's a pretty decent level of English in a lot of the towns. Once you get more into the countryside, it's perhaps less likely. But we met quite a few people who spoke a decent amount of English, and so we were able to have some good in-depth conversations at least a couple of times a day in that section of the trip.
And I noticed as well, people are always inviting you guys into their houses for coffee and food and stuff like that. What's the coffee like over there? Is it pretty strong?
Yeah, the coffee really gets the motor running. It's a pretty strong sort of stuff. But the tea is what people seem to live on, especially the Bedouin. So as we were walking through the hills, we'd meet endless Bedouin guys out with their flocks of sheep, and they'd always invite us in for this sweet tea, which is just basically tea leaves boiled up with loads and loads of sugar. So it's incredibly sweet, really nice, especially when you've been hiking. But you end up having 10 or 15 cups of that a day because the hospitality is, I mean, it's just incredible there. It's partly it's cultural and partly it's religious. You know, it's a big part of the Islamic faith to be hospitable and to welcome people in. But people don't just do it because they feel like like they should because of their faith. They do it because they really want to. And especially in somewhere like the West Bank, which doesn't get really much tourism at all, people are even more inclined to invite you in, and they're just super excited to see someone and to talk to you and to ask you questions about where you're from and to tell you stuff about their life. And, you know, by the time you get through all of that, you get through a lot of sweet tea. So it kind of requires a bit of training to be able to take that much sugar in every day.
And as you're walking from day to day, were there any others that sort of joined you along the way for a bit, or was it mainly you two?
We were the kind of core, I guess. We had some friends from Jerusalem and other places that came out to walk with us for a day or two. There's a couple of times when we hired a local guy to walk with us, a guide essentially, to give us a bit more insight into the places we were passing through. You know, so we might understand it a bit more. Yeah, that was it. So, you know, a kind of nice mix between just the two of us and then having some nice company as well.
And I believe Dave got injured and he had to go back to the UK. Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean that was a real shame because walking is really low impact, and one of the reasons walking is great is because of that. And but once you add on a heavy pack and you know you're climbing a lot and you're doing long days, it really does require. I guess it requires quite a bit of training to get used to that. And Dave and I thought we were being quite sensible and started with low distances and everything else, but our packs were heavy, and you know, a couple of days we just had to go further than we would have liked. And I think this is the first time he'd ever done anything like this walking. He'd done lots of other, you know, tough physical challenges, but nothing with that much extra weight, which just puts so much more pressure down through your body. And he got a couple of stress fractures in his left foot, and that was that, unfortunately.
And how many days into the journey did this happen?
Well, it was just under a month. We'd finished the West Bank and crossed into northern Jordan, and we were heading south, but we'd only a couple of days into the southern, that kind of southern trajectory. So he felt it pretty early on. We took a break and went to a doctor and took a few weeks off to see if it would heal, and then it didn't. So I restarted 3 or 4 weeks after that, back in the very northern border of Jordan, heading south.
And then when he basically couldn't continue, were you having doubts at all that whether you should continue, or you just knew that you were just going to continue yourself?
Yeah, it was never really in doubt that I would continue. It was a real shame because we'd been really excited about doing this journey together, and you know, Dave's similar to me in that he's self-employed in this rather sort of strange world of being an adventurer, and it's actually, you know, quite, because we're always having to look out for different income streams and writing and making films and everything else. It's actually quite hard to plan time, scheduling time to go on the adventures that generates all of this. And so it's taken us a few years to find a slot where we could do something together, and for it to end quite abruptly was a real shame. But we both put so much work into it that it was never really in doubt that we'd go and do it. And that's one of the other nice things as well about this kind of idea of adventure with a bit of a purpose to it as well, because, you know, I'm a huge advocate of adventure for just self-development and just for the hell of it, to be honest, you know, just going out and having an adventure because it feels good. But what I also really value highly is using adventure for a greater purpose, and our aim really was to debunk a lot of the myths about the Middle East, and so it was nice to have that as one of the real driving forces of this trip, because it meant that I was certain that I should continue.
So do you reckon, does the media blow it up a bit or a lot? Because I know in Australia, what we see on TV is probably what would be shown on TV in the UK, with, the occupation and the Palestinians being oppressed and a lot of the war stuff kicking off. Is it really like that or not really?
Well, it is. I mean, I think a lot of what the media shows is generally true, with a few notable exceptions, but generally it is true. Syria is just, a heartbreaking disaster at the minute, and Iraq is really struggling, and the occupation is incredibly difficult for the Palestinians, and there's a lot of brutality and violence and just and real distress there. But the key thing is that bad news sells, right? So bad news is what gets reported, and in actual fact, although those are all really major issues, there are relatively small parts of the overall kind of land space and life in the Middle East. And there's a heck of a lot of people in the Middle East just getting on with life and living very peacefully and living very normally. And that doesn't get reported because it's not kind of cool and thrilling and exciting for people to read. And the Middle East is also huge. It incorporates a lot of different cultures and traditions, and the fact that the term the Middle East includes places like Iran, which is ancient Persia and Saudi Arabia and the Arab world, and then this part of the Levant that we were traveling in, and North Africa. It's so diverse. So our goal was really just to show that diversity and to show that for all the bad news that comes out of it, there's an off, that's the minority. The majority is good people living normal lives, much like the rest of the world. And while that might not be as exciting and good at selling newspapers and good at generating headlines, it's really important to remember, because that's what defines the region more than the other stuff.
Now, with the actual Massar, is it like a trail, or is it like a pilgrimage that people do? What is the Massar?
Yeah, it's a good question. Basically, Massar, the word is just the Arabic word for trail or path. And the first trail that we walked was in Palestine, was called the Massar Ibrahim al-Khalil, which is the path of Abraham to Hebron, to the city where Abraham is buried. But we like this idea of the word Massar, and because we were following these new trails in the region, we decided to go with calling our journey Walk the Massar. So it's a really conceptual idea, because then we moved on to another trail in Jordan called the Jordan Trail, and another one in Sinai called the Sinai Trail. But I kind of like the idea of the Massar simply just being this path, because everyone who goes on an adventure finds a path to go on, whether they make it up for themselves or they're following one that's already there. And it's kind of a nice way to think about things.
And what did a typical day look like for you? How was it? Was it freezing at night? Was it super hot in the day? What time did you start walking for the day, and what time did you sort of stop?
It changed all the way through. When I was on my own, I'd get up pretty early. It wasn't, when you're on your own, there's not much point in just hanging around. You get bored of your own company. So and also the days were getting longer. It was pretty cold at night, and sometimes during the day as well to begin with. But as the months moved on and I walked south, it was getting more into spring. So I'd normally be up and walking by maybe 6 o'clock in the morning. And I'd finish around, the sun would set, kind of 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, something like that, as I moved south. And as it got hotter, the further into spring it went, I'd eventually take a break in the middle of the day for an hour or 2 hours and just have a sleep under a tree in the heat of the day to avoid suffering in that. And I do, if I was passing through areas where there were a lot of people, I'd spend as much time as I could stopping and talking to people, and maybe only do 20 kilometers a day, sort of 12, 13 miles. But if there wasn't much to see or do, I'd do 40, 50 kilometers a day, 25, 30 miles, something like that. And so every day was different, which is the beauty of these things.
And were you actually on a time? Did you have to finish this by a particular time, or was it just open ended? You had an endpoint in mind, and you were just heading towards that endpoint, or did you have to be at the endpoint by a certain sort of date?
No, I didn't. I was pretty open with it. When Dave and I had been doing it together, we both, we'd scheduled it in, and we had other engagements that were going to follow on, and it was looking like it might be a bit of a rush. But when Dave got injured, we both had to cancel a number of things anyway back home, and I realized that actually this journey just needed to be given the amount of time that it required, which was relatively open-ended. So that was mainly the approach. I didn't want to be doing it for 6 or 12 months, and if I'd really engaged in every conversation that started, and if I'd really looked at every historical site en route, I'd still be there. It would just have taken such a long time. So I did have to make some choices about what I was going to do and what I wasn't going to do. And I figured that 4 months was a pretty good chunk of my life to dedicate to this, and I'd try and finish on the top of Mount Sinai within that time frame.
And what about sourcing water? During the day, were you carrying water, or those times where you were running low or even out? Are there many towns along the way that you went through, or were there vast patches where you were just going through the desert? How did you source the water?
Yeah, in Palestine, it wasn't that difficult at all, because there's always, it's quite a small area, quite compact. So there's a lot of towns and villages to fill up in. Sinai had a camel, which could carry water, so that wasn't a problem. Jordan was the toughest part. There was sometimes stretches. I think the biggest was about 60-something kilometers, 40-something miles between water sources. And that meant I had to, carry enough for a couple of days worth, which is really pretty heavy, especially in the heat. You're drinking upwards of 6 liters a day. So I'd have to carry that weight on top of my pack, which was already, nearly 25 kilograms. But I'd either fill in little towns or fill from fresh water sources like the wadis, which are the big canyons that run across Jordan. And I had a pretty good detailed map of which ones would have water in them. And I had a bottle made by a company called Water to Go, which has they kind of make these bottles that have built-in filters which get rid of 99.9% of all known bacteria. So that just meant that I could fill up all my water from these rivers and carry it and just make sure I drank it through the filter, and I wouldn't have to worry about getting sick.
And what about like visas when you're going across borders? Did you need to? Is it free to walk from across borders there, or do you need to have the visas already applied for prior to even commencing this journey, or can you apply for the visa when you arrive at the border?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I mean, one of the greatest privileges of being British or Irish, I've got 2 passports, is that it's so wonderfully easy to travel. It's ridiculously easy to travel a lot of the time on those passports, and I was able to get all the visas I needed just upon arrival at the border. There was a couple of borders between some of the countries that wouldn't have issued them, but as I planned my route so that it went to the ones that did. And you just pay whatever the fee is and get the stamp. So that's the beauty of having one of these powerful passports, which I feel a little guilty about sometimes because I didn't do anything to earn that, but that's such a great gift for travelers, is if you have a passport that can allow that to happen.
And you also, I noticed on your website, there was some weekly video. You did some weekly video blogs. Some schools were asking questions. Did you have were you carrying a computer or a smartphone or anything like that? How did you?
Yeah, we were carrying a whole ton of stuff. Really, we I really love that technology's improved so much now that you can beam stuff live through stuff like Skype or recently recorded through YouTube from the middle of a desert in Jordan into a classroom in Ontario or the southeast of England or the east coast of Australia or wherever it is. I think it's just amazing, and it's one of the great things about adventures like this is that they help to show the world as a real place. And if you're that's certainly how I learn and experience things, is when I see them. Seeing them for myself is the best way, but seeing them through someone else's eyes is also pretty good. It makes something seem real, and I think for education purposes that can be really powerful to show a classroom full of kids that this desert is a real place, and these Jordanians are real people, and that also helps to kind of to paint a real picture of what it's like there. I carried a computer and a smartphone and a camera and all the cables and batteries and a ridiculous amount of communications devices in one way, but it allowed us to do that, which is worth it, I think.
And with the footage that you shot, did you back up the footage at all, or did you post home if you could, whatever you could, or did you just have it sort of tucked away safely in your bag somewhere?
I tried to back it up as often as I could. I didn't post anything, but we had some friends in Jerusalem who we were able to, every time someone came out to join us in the West Bank, we would send back a hard drive with them so they could transfer it onto a master drive in Jerusalem. We had some friends in Amman in Jordan who worked for a tour company there called Experience Jordan, who had helped us a lot with planning the logistics of the trip. And they also kindly let us use their offices to store some stuff. So once in a while, I'd try and meet up with someone from there on the trail and, send back some footage. And just the key with these sorts of things is to have multiple physical copies of the footage. So we would have some on the cards that it was recorded onto. I'd have 2 separate hard drives, and then there'd be 2 hard drives in the office in Amman as well. So in theory, the footage could be in 5 different places at once. But as long as it was in 2, that was all that was needed. As soon as I knew it was safely on the drives in Amman, I'd delete it off the hard drives that were with me. It's unlikely that let anything go wrong, but if I was to fall in a river and my dry bag wasn't secured properly, or I lost something, it's just not worth the risk. So I become pretty risk averse with that stuff.
Were there any instances where you got into trouble filming, either filming the locals or filming particular sites or monuments or anything like that, either on this trip or other trips that you've been on?
Well, yeah, and other trips a lot. I mean, in Iran, it was a nightmare to try and make a film because no one wanted us. The authorities didn't want us to make a film at all. So we were at Tom, who I did that trip with. Tom and I were constantly running into issues with being told that we couldn't film stuff, and it was all quite stressful. In China, we ran into quite a lot of problems as well, trying to film the same thing. Quite kind of oppressive filming regulations. This trip was quite nice. One of the strange byproducts of the occupation in the Palestinian territories is that people there are used. They're maybe not used to tourists because no one really goes to the West Bank on holiday, but they are used to cameras because there's been so much international media there over the years. So it wasn't that unusual for them to see cameras there. Jordan was a bit more unusual in Sinai. There wasn't really many people in Sinai anyway, so we could film away freely. But I just had to be relatively culturally aware. It's normally not acceptable to film women, and that's one of the biggest things to know, and certainly not to film them without permission, and in general not to film anyone without asking their permission. So a lot of that sort of stuff. A few times I was asked not to film, but mostly I checked in advance, and it was quite nice not having police breathing down my neck for trying to make a film for once on this trip.
So those times when you got busted in like Iran and in China, did they actually want to see the footage that you'd taken? Or did they just sort of say, no, you can't do it?
Yeah, a couple of times that happened. I mean, it went the whole spectrum. But in Iran, we were asked to show what we'd been filming, and we had kind of secret police go through our footage and make sure we hadn't filmed anything that we shouldn't have, which is pretty much anything. And luckily, in that when that happened, it was the first time, and we hadn't really shot very much. And then other times we were just told not to do it, and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's kind of a hard one, but that's what happens when you try and make films in places that are perhaps unusual tourist destinations.
Have you ever had to bribe your way out of a situation at all?
I don't think I have, actually. I find that a good tool is just pretending, or perhaps just being really stupid, and playing very dumb and smiling a lot and being very friendly. I have in the past carried a pack of cigarettes around, even though I don't smoke, just because a lot of the world, especially the Middle East, when you're with a group of these kind of Middle Eastern policemen, or other kind of heavies somewhere, it's often quite nice to be able to offer around a cigarette because pretty much everyone in the entire region smokes. But no, I generally try and stay away. I don't really know enough about each of the places I'm passing through to know what would be a good idea to bribe and what wouldn't. So I generally just play dumb and smile, and that seems to work eventually as well.
And whereabouts do you draw your inspiration from? You're on these incredible journeys, and whereabouts do you draw that from?
Do you mean for the kind of concept of the journeys, or?
I guess maybe when you're on the journey, and possibly those times where you're maybe going through some particular low point. Where do you draw your inspiration, or where do you draw motivation from to continue moving forward?
The key thing to remember with all of this stuff is that it's self-inflicted, right? So it's I've chosen to be there. No one has forced me to be. So if I'm really miserable, that's my own fault, and I have to remind myself that actually the reason I'm there is kind of greater than whatever temporary pain or suffering I'm going through. And there's a lot of people in the world who've got it a lot worse than I do. So that kind of trying to bring myself back down to earth a little bit normally helps. But I mean, you're right. It's physically, these things can get pretty tough, and that affects your mental state as well, and you do get pretty low. So I just try and imagine what would happen if I was to give up, and how much I'd ultimately regret it. And just reinforce that idea that I'm very fortunate to be there, and I should be very thankful for that. And a few blisters and a few aching limbs and another couple of long days without much sleep, it's unlikely to kill me.
And on the Massar walk, was there a particular moment that's really stood out for you on that journey?
I really enjoyed crossing Sinai. Walking from the coast of the Red Sea to the top of Mount Sinai. It took about 11 or 12 days, I think, and it was the end of the journey, and I felt like I'd seen quite a lot already, but it was a change in landscape again, and even more wild and varied, and really empty. And Sinai is another place that gets a pretty bad rap these days, but it's just beautiful and so safe in the south. There's nothing to be afraid of in the south of Sinai. So that was a real high point, was just having this end goal of Mount Sinai, slowly approaching, and then finally, getting there and seeing this great desert and these mountains unfold before me, and knowing that I'd get to spend the last bit of my trip walking through them.
You didn't see the burning bush at all?
Well, I did. I went to, when I finished in Sinai, I went to the town of St. Catherine and went to the monastery there, and saw the burning bush, which is looking a bit worse for wear these days. It's looking pretty old and pretty ragged, and it's not on fire anymore. But that's the one, apparently.
Yeah, it seems as though, you do all these incredible adventures, and you're documenting them, and making them into films. Do you think this is sort of, these two aspects are sort of seeds that are sprouting into like a humanitarian type thing, where you're shedding light on various parts of the world that most people probably wouldn't ever get to, and showing how people live, how things are?
Yeah, I would certainly like that. I would like people to take that away from these things. There's two very distinct strands. One is inherently selfish, and the other, I hope, is reasonably selfless. An adventure is generally a very self-indulgent activity. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it does really help us in a lot of ways. It's great for developing, self-confidence and learning a lot more about ourselves. And I love it. I love being out in the world and kind of testing myself and challenging myself and seeing how I get on and seeing the world and chalking up all these experiences. But, I then feel, or increasingly have felt over the last few years, a sense of responsibility to somehow pay back all of these great kindnesses that have been bestowed upon me in these places, and just knowing what it's like, at least in the small corner of the world where I grew up, and the misunderstandings there of the rest of the world. I think it's a nice challenge to set myself in life, to just do at least some small bit of trying to redress that balance a little bit. And doing it through adventure is nice, because it can, for some people, it can seem quite dry. These humanitarian messages can seem quite dry, and I know that in regular print journalism, that journalists have these awful kind of moral conundrums where once a certain amount of people have died somewhere, like in the conflict in Syria, they know that readers stop being interested, because it's just the same thing over and over again. So they've got to kind of figure out, how do we keep telling people what's going on in these terrible places without boring them, even though it's just awful because it's loss of life, but it's because it doesn't seem real and it seems so disconnected and so far away. So I think adventure is a nice tool to show in a much kind of calmer way some of these other parts of the world. And I also generally like to try and focus on the positive stuff, because there's enough people out there reporting the negative aspects of life, but to try and focus on positivity and show the hope and resilience and kindness and generosity that exists in the world. If that can be a kind of life mission for me, then I'd be pretty happy with that.
And what have you learned about yourself going on these adventures?
That's the $1 million question. You learn something new every time, but what I just tried to articulate really is a big part of that learning experience. For me, a lot of this is trying to find, my purpose and passion and place in the world, and trying to balance out the stuff I like doing with the stuff that I think is worthwhile. But adventure is just a fantastic way to really dig around and see what you're made of. And I think generally we surprise ourselves. We're capable of so much more than we often imagine. And I've certainly learned that I'm much more capable and competent when I'm out there in the world. I can solve problems, and I can deal with scenarios where things go wrong, and I can make things happen in ways that I would never have given myself credit for. And that's really nice, because it's given me a quite a deep sense of self-confidence, which I never really had growing up. So it's really useful for that, but it's constantly developing. Every journey teaches you something new.
And what was it like carrying the Olympic flame? Well, when was that, for the London 2012?
Yeah, 2012.
Did you actually get to keep the baton at all?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Well, I had to buy it. I was allowed to keep it if I paid them £300 for it. But it was good. I mean, I just got back from this journey in China, which had taken about 7 months and was the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life, and I was exhausted, having just walked 3,000 miles. And I'd kind of got quite ill towards the end of that journey. I'm not sure quite what was happening, but I was sort of having these strange dizzy spells and hallucinations and blurred vision and all this sort of stuff. And I got back, and about 2 days later I had to carry the Olympic flame. So I had to run with that. I can't remember how far it was. It was some sort of pitifully small distance, like a mile or something. And I sort of vaguely remember staggering around down the road with this and having crowds of people cheering. And it mostly felt like some, hallucinogenic experience. So I think I enjoyed it, but I don't remember a whole lot about it. But it was it's kind of one of those things that I think when I'm older I'll feel incredibly privileged to have been able to do.
Well, you've done so many things that we just don't have time for to go into, but trekking 1,000 miles through the empty quarter. What is it about deserts that you love?
I was talking to a guy in Jordan a month or so ago, and he was asking me the same thing, I suppose I was telling him that I love deserts. I was saying, just something about deserts, it's really amazing. And he said, well, we always like the things that we don't have. And he was saying, what I really like is green hills. I like greenery and all the stuff that you have in Ireland that you take for granted. So maybe it's that deserts are just about the furthest, most alien landscape from where I grew up in Northern Ireland. But there's something about just that vast expanse and that emptiness and all the challenges that are inherent with that, and the requirements for someone to survive and thrive there. And there's a real kind of beauty in that sparseness, and I just can't get enough of them.
So at the moment, where are you? You're in Oman?
I'm in Oman at the minute. I'm here for another week or so, and then back to London for running some filmmaking workshops, and then hopefully I'll start writing the book about this journey in the Middle East.
Just on books, you've published another book. What book was that?
Yeah, my first book. It was about the first adventure that I did. That kind of rite of passage journey of setting off on a bicycle and seeing what happens. That one's called The Road Headed West, and so that I published that a couple of years ago, and I'm overdue another book. So hopefully this Masar one will be it.
You know, as you're coming towards the end of these adventures, like this particular one, like, you know, you're at the top of Mount Sinai. Do you ever get like a feeling of as though you've come down from the high, and does your mind start thinking, oh, what's the next adventure going to be? Do you sort of juggle? Have you sort of got other adventures in mind that you're sort of toying with or even planning?
Yeah, I mean, always planning ahead, probably too much. So I sometimes wish I could just enjoy the moment a little bit more. But it is addictive, you know, and anyone who's been on adventures, big or small, in life will know this. It's a very addictive thing. But I think part of doing these things for so long, and you kind of get older and you mature a little, and I'm less inclined, and I desire less now to go off for months and months and years at a time. And I quite like having some stability, and I like, you know, knowing that I have a group of friends somewhere, and I have a community somewhere, and I like coming back to that and experience that side of life as well, and having a bit of that before I set off again. So I don't have a desire to be permanently nomadic anymore, and that's quite a nice evolution of thinking.
And do you have any advice for someone who wants to embark on a many month long or many thousands of miles long adventure? Is there any sort of tips or nuggets of wisdom that you could maybe share with listeners? You know, someone that is considering doing something like this?
It's a cliche, but I mean, you just need to get started. You just need to commit to doing it. The stars are unlikely to ever align perfectly for you to be able to go and do whatever it is that you want to do, you know, and it's tempting to always wait until conditions are perfect. And I've never set off on a trip and thought, do you know what? I'm fully prepared for this. That's never happened. And you could always have more money, or, you know, better companions, or some companions, or you know, the right experience. So it's just, if you want to do it, go and do it. You know, just do something that forces you. Tell lots of people that you're going to do it. Quit your job. You know, save some money, whatever you need to do, but just force yourself, back yourself into a corner, so that there's no way out, because the kind of human survival instinct will kick in at some point and say, this is ridiculous and you shouldn't do this, and stop it and go and be normal again. And you got to try and fight that, and go and do it anyway, because it'll be worth it. It always is.
And whereabouts can people find you online and follow your future adventures and read up on all your past adventures? And yeah, whereabouts can people find you?
The hub for all of my stuff is my website, which is just my name.com, leonmccarron.com. The Masar trip has got its own dedicated website called walkthemasar, masar.com. And I'm on all of the normal time-wasting social media accounts where I spend too much of my life, like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all on Leon McCarron as well.
Cool. Well, I'll put all the links in the show notes. Thanks again for your time. Yeah, you've done some really inspirational adventures that are really quite incredible, to be honest. Yeah, and I look forward to your book coming out, and the documentary, the Walk the Masar film that you're going to produce. Thanks again for coming on to the Born to Kick Arse podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I think your podcast has got the best name of any of the podcasts I've ever done.
Cheers.
Good work.
Yeah, thanks.
Cheers.
You've just been listening to the Born to Kick Arse podcast at borntokickarse.com. If you liked what you heard and want more, please subscribe on iTunes. Give a 5-star rating and a Kick Arse review. This really helps to boost our presence and continues to allow us to introduce you to the most fascinating people on the planet. Welcome aboard and catch you next time.